He has written for the New York Times, the National Geographic. He's also an award-winning documentarian in his own right. And we're really proud to have an example of his artwork in our collection, which as you go out into the Collector's Circle exhibit, you'll see a rhino that is very, reminiscent of the style of these other pieces. So James is very interested in how we see and perceive animals. He was telling me last night he's very interested in how we name them or don't name them and observe them. And so I think I'll stop there and let him tell you more about what he's interested in. So, without any further ado, here's James Prosek.
Thank
you all for having me. And so, do you want me to sort of roam around and talk a little bit, or leave some time for
questions? But yeah, walk around and
thank you, everybody I've met here at the museum so far. Has been very warm and welcoming, and thank you for taking on the exhibition.
Speak up.
So, yeah, I'm the token artist part of the exhibition. But, and Adam mentioned that this is kind of an interdisciplinary exhibition. And it's worth noting, I think, that part of the sort of reduced or simplified story about how Yellowstone Park came about is that this scientist, this geologist, Ferdinand Hayden, who drew the first line on a map that showed the outlines of where Yellowstone might be in 1872, maybe, or something, had invited an artist, Thomas Moran, and a photographer, William Henry Jackson, to accompany him on, I think, an 1871 expedition to Yellowstone to help sort of accumulate some imagery that would show people back in the East who may not have had the opportunity to see this wonderland, what this place was all about, what it looked like. And the main impetus, I think, for creating the park originally was to protect the geological wonders, the everything you've seen, the Old Faithfuls, the mud pots and fumaroles and hot springs, and it is one of the most unique places in the world for thermal features that are visible on the surface. So it's worth noting that what helped convince Congress to create what became the first national park in the world was partly because of a collaboration between a scientist, an artist, and a photographer. Although it's more complex than that, it is part of the story. So we felt, without being too presumptuous in comparing ourselves to these people, that the story that wasn't told about Yellowstone at that time was the story about the wildlife and the migrations in the park. They were more focused on as I mentioned, on the geological wonders. And I think it was partly because of the technology that was available at the time, because photographers couldn't take pictures of animals at that time because they would set up a tripod and have these long exposures, if I'm not mistaken, and any organism would just be a blur. So there were certain limitations to documenting the animal wonders, although I'm sure there's some little elk and things off in the distance in Moran's paintings, right, Adam? Or not that
He's
much.
not a great wildlife.
Yeah, I mean, Bierstadt did a little more than Moran, but in any case, the story of the movement of creatures in and out of this region wasn't told. So we thought through this collaboration we could tell a story, and the title of the exhibition is relevant in many ways, at least to me, Invisible Boundaries. So one of the main points of the title is that this line that was created in 1872 started as a line on a map, and a line on a map is a conceptual line that exists really just in the brains of humans, but the animals don't know that the line is there. And ever since that line was drawn in 1872 and changed and it has morphed over the years, people have encroached on that line. So the line has actually come to be more relevant for the movements of animals. The invisible boundary title also has relevance to our collaboration too, because we're trying to sort of blur the lines between these disciplines that are really all trying to say similar things. Art, science, photography, whatever they may be. We call them different things, but they're all part of the human attempt to express and make sense of the world around us. But part of my interest in being part of this exhibition, I first met Arthur Middleton, the ecologist part of the exhibit, and you can see some of his work. Well, it's all over, but he got his PhD at University of Wyoming and studied elk and wolf interactions in the park, and became interested in the migrations of elk, and was one of the first people to put all this satellite data together that they've been collecting by putting satellite collars on elk and tracking them in and out of the park. A lot of data existed in different parts of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but people are sometimes defensive or proprietary about their data and didn't necessarily always want to share, but somehow he was able to put it all together and show these 6 or 8 radiating migrations of elk. The elk spend the summers primarily in the park area because it's a high plateau that's green and grassy in the summer. There's a lot of food, but in the winter, because it's on a high plateau, it's very inhospitable in the winter to anything that eats grass. So they leave for lower country where there's more food, and they end up a lot of times on private lands, like in the Cody herd in the east part of the park, which is the primary elk herd that we were spending time with as research for the exhibition. Most of the 6,000 or so animals spend the winters on 2 private ranches, the Hoodoo Ranch, which is roughly 250,000 acres, and the Pitchfork Ranch, which is about 150,000 acres. So the people who own those parcels are responsible. They have a big responsibility, and another one of the boundaries that Arthur's been trying to render more invisible maybe are political boundaries between conservative interests and more liberal NGO interests, and Arthur has been, trying to carefully navigate these different, realities and say that, there are many different valid viewpoints in this great region, and that it's now a hybrid ecosystem, whether we like it or not, and people are a big part of it, and ranching's a big part of it, and we all have to work together to ensure that these migrating animals are still able to migrate. So when an elk or some animal crosses the boundary of Yellowstone Park, its identity can change just by, they can't see the line necessarily, but inside the park they're sort of protected as a tourist attraction or just an animal. But when they cross that line, they can become designated by the whatever wildlife service it is as a trophy for hunters, or a pest, and they can be killed, or different things can happen to them. And as you know, there's many interesting and sort of contentious discussions about, in particular, wolves and things. And I won't necessarily go into those right now, but just suffice it to say I'm interested in what happens when creatures cross these lines that they don't know about, and their worlds can change. Tonight I'll show some slides of my work and how I, outside of this exhibition, try to express some of these interests in movements and migrations in nature. But it started for me growing up in southwestern Connecticut in a town called Easton, where there's several drinking water reservoirs. And when they created these reservoirs and dammed the rivers to make the drinking water supply, they left a lot of, they pushed the farmers out through eminent domain, and that was sort of controversial in the 19-teens. when they did this big sort of hydro scheme to provide water for this city called Bridgeport that was growing. But they left all this big watershed land, thousands of acres around the reservoirs to naturally filter the water. And I grew up in this time when the reservoirs existed, and the beautiful sort of how it got there, you know, is a different story. But I grew up on a street that dead-ended on one of these reservoirs. It used to go into the rest of town, but when they dammed the river to make the reservoir, it got cut off. And so if I walked in the woods past the end of my street, I'd see these no trespassing signs, you know, public water supply, no hunting, fishing, swimming, trapping. But to a kid, those signs were like a welcome here sign. And I loved fishing in the reservoir, and I didn't see any harm in what I was doing. And so I started questioning these boundaries when I didn't even think about it until I started years later thinking about it. I was thinking about it, but not consciously maybe. But in my mind, the animals like deer, and I could see deer, squirrels, wild turkeys cross this line where these signs were, but it didn't make sense that I couldn't cross the line just because some stupid sign said that I couldn't. Of course, I liked that there was a sign there because it meant that most people didn't go there. So so there's a little bit of like a privileged idea that I had. I was, you know, the risk was also fun that you could get caught by a game warden, which I eventually did and became friends with him. But and I wrote a book about our friendship called Joe and Me. So these ideas about lines that humans draw in nature, where lines don't necessarily exist, has been a theme of my work for a long time. I wrote a book about freshwater eels, which live in almost every eastern river and watershed. They live their adult lives in freshwater, but they spawn out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in an area called the Sargasso Sea. People still have never witnessed eels spawning out there, and I'm working on an article right now for National Geographic about the Sargasso, and I pushed very hard to get an eel on this map of other animals that move. I think it's still there on this map. Oh, it's on one of them. But in any case, in working on this book for 12 years about this fish that make these amazing migrations from fresh and salt water, fresh to salt and back again, whichever way they go, just like salmon, I of course started to learn about how these migrations are compromised by physical barriers that we've built in the landscape. In particular, for fish, dams affect the migrations of these creatures. And in this exhibition about Yellowstone, there are very interesting parallels, for me at least. Like Joe Reese took some great photos that are very sad of like pronghorns with their legs caught in barbed wire, or you know, migrations of ungulates having trouble crossing a highway. They're trying to create, you know, passes now, which is great. But so the lines aren't always just invisible or conceptual. Sometimes they're actually manifested and built by humans. So when I started talking to Arthur about working, being a part of this exhibition, originally at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, the movements of animals in and out of what we call the greater Yellowstone ecosystem were pretty much like, you know, the elk were very much like my eels. So it made a lot of sense to me, and it was part of a lot of the things I'd been thinking about. And I love this region. The first time I ever went in an airplane when I was 13 years old was to come out to Jackson to go to camp at Teton Valley Ranch Camp, which was at Kelly at the time. And so having an excuse to spend time in this region was part of the impetus for wanting to be part of this exhibition. And in any case, so Arthur told the story through his scientific work and putting satellite collars on elk and stuff. And Joe's work is mostly done through remote camera traps. So through Arthur's work, where they find the migration routes, and in some places there are these bottlenecks or pinch points where a migration of elk has to go through a canyon and cross a river. So if Joe sets up a camera in that pinch point, he can basically get a picture of every animal on that migration. And oftentimes I got photographs of the actual collared elk that Arthur could see on his computer through, the satellite collars. So Joe's pictures show these animals in very intimate ways. You can see as you walk around the exhibition. To me, the photos aren't just of animals as members of a species like they're elk. They're like individuals like you and I are. You can see them sweating and the possible scars on their bodies from their travels. A couple of the elk that he photographed had broken legs and were still, moving. It's a pretty arduous migration that these animals make, and they didn't know until they put satellite collars on these elk that exactly where they went or how they moved. In the case of the Cody herd, they go right up over the top of this mountain called Needle Mountain, and it's just like, why don't they go around like the pass, or they just go up and over? And it's pretty remarkable. But what I thought I could contribute was trying to illuminate some of the other migrations of creatures outside of elk and mule deer and things like that. The birds that migrate, like western tanagers, migrate from the park area to Mexico or Central America, or the army cutworm moths that originate in the central part of the country in the plains and fly in their adult stage to the mountains of Wyoming and Montana, where they make up to 70% of the diet of grizzly bears in the summer. They can eat 40 to 60,000 of these moths a day. But that food source is in jeopardy if they spray a lot of pesticides on these alfalfa fields in Kansas and Nebraska, where the moths are in their larval stage. So I made that piece over there showing, there were more of them in the Cody show, but it sort of meant to show just the abundance of these moths that parts of the ecosystem rely on to survive. As you walk around, you'll see, like in that picture of the grizzly bear, there's silhouettes of birds with numbers, the source material for the silhouettes and numbers are these old field guides that you've probably seen, where there's silhouettes of creatures with numbers, and the numbers match up to a list of names to help us identify creatures in the field. And I grew up with these field guides, like Roger Tory Peterson's Field Guide to the Birds, and but I'd grown a little bit critical of my own impulse to want to know the name of everything, and other people's impulses to just, if you're a birder, check a bird off the list once you've seen it and you've identified it. Sometimes you just put it in a box and walk away. But so I paint the silhouettes and the numbers, but there's no key, so people can't satisfy their urge to know what the name is. And then once they get over their frustration that they can't know, they may know that it's a raven or some kind of owl, but they can't know for sure because there's no key, then maybe they just stop and can appreciate the beauty of the form and structure of the animal without needing to know what it's called. And so parallel to this interest in boundaries we impose on the landscape, I've been working on a book for years about how and why we name and order nature. And part of the impetus for making works like this is that I feel like when we put a name on something and call it a wolf or a cow or a tree or a cat, that our minds put a little box around it, and then we think of these things as individual creatures that live in separate boxes, but really in an ecosystem, everything's interacting with everything else. It's more holistic, and I think sometimes the way we use language can get in the way of seeing the world as it really is, which is more kind of interconnected. Not only do we interact in an ecosystem and affect everything else, and everything we do has consequences, but we're all connected to every other creature on a vast evolutionary timeline back to single-celled organisms. So we're related to fish and to bacteria and other things like that. So as a kid, I was really inordinately obsessed with trout and painting trout. And when I was trying to put this book together as a teenager, because I couldn't find a book on the trout of North America, and as Adam said, the book that I published came out in 1996 when I was 19 or 20 years old, because I started working on it when I was 10. I was writing letters to wildlife departments around the country asking what kind of trout lived in Wyoming or Nevada, and I got very nice responses from different biologists who studied particular types of trout, oftentimes their whole lives. And I started putting a list together of all the different trout of North America, the names of the species. But very soon I realized that no two biologists could agree on how many species there were, or subspecies, or varieties, and so it occurred to me that if you believe in evolution and that things evolve on a continuum, that there's no clear place where you can draw a line sometimes between the Yellowstone cutthroat and the Snake River fine-spotted cutthroat, because they evolved together, were separated maybe by a big ice dam during the Ice Age, and then when the ice melted they recombined and could hybridize again. So the point is that nature's messy, but humans want neat, orderly ways of seeing things. So the fact that the border of Yellowstone is basically a box, it illustrates well for me that kind of thing. So I don't want to, I could keep talking for a while, but what should I do, Adam? Should I maybe talk about more? There's one more specific work I can mention.
Yeah.
You want to go?
Yeah.
In any case, this piece behind you has about 600 silhouettes of different animals that live in what we call, I guess, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And it's in a box partly because Yellowstone the boundary is a box, or it originally was. It's changed and expanded over the years, but I think it's possible that many visitors to the park think that the animals stay inside the park, but there's no wall that keeps them inside. But not only do they move, but many of them move vast, long distances, as you know. And at a certain point working on this exhibition, I started to have a problem even with the term ecosystem, because it implies that there's an end to where that ecosystem ends, but there isn't. It's connected to other ecosystems by things that move long distances, like, as I mentioned, the western tanager, for instance, that moves from Central America or southern Mexico back and forth to Yellowstone, or the monarch butterfly that migrates to Mexico. Even the Yellowstone cutthroat, they've tagged and tracked, that they can move 30, 40 miles in a river system, which is pretty remarkable. They are descended from Pacific salmon, so it makes sense they have an instinct to move. But there are certain places where the trout would also cross the boundary of Yellowstone. So Yellowstone isn't sort of a box with stuff in it. It's a moving, breathing, as you all know. I mean, many of you know this better than I do because you live here. I live in Connecticut, but this is my humble attempt to sort of express some of these feelings. Some of the works are in different media. There are watercolors, there are acrylic paintings, sometimes with a little oil paint. This was made by drawing the silhouettes and then digitizing them and arranging them on the computer, and then it was silk screened onto the panels, and then I painted a bunch of the animals in color that have particularly interesting migration stories. But any questions?
How many are in color? I can't tell.
There's 12. Yeah, I think. Yeah. There's I think a Harris's hawk, a harlequin duck, a burrowing owl, a pelican, monarch butterfly, a cutthroat trout, a long-billed curlew maybe, pronghorn, yellow, red-winged blackbird, sandhill crane, western tanager, Yellowstone cutthroat trout, maybe a couple others. But the bison, I think, would move in and out of the park if the U.S. government let them. But as you know, there's a lot of debate. Yeah, the potential for them to transmit brucellosis to cows, so they oftentimes kill anyone to try to leave the park, which is unfortunate for the bison. But you know, it's a reality that everyone has to live with, I guess, or die with if you're the bison. Trying to think what else I can mention. The main scientific feature of the exhibition is this projection map. So it's a three-dimensional map of the region, and then there's a projection that shows, if you sit long enough and watch it or press the right buttons, you can see the elk moving seasonally in and out of the park in these different radiating migrations, and it's pretty fascinating. Anybody have a?
I have a question. Has this worked?
Lisa Simmons, hi.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Have you worked with? I mean, have any scientists that worked on this project also touched on ancient human migrations that also follow these patterns, and how they correlate, or maybe we can use the animals to sort of help us better understand the ancient humans.
Yeah. There was the question was about roughly how are the scientists possibly using anthropological evidence of more ancient humans following these migrations. It's hard to. There was I'm trying to remember the name of this anthropologist in the Cody area, but he was trying to show that people, Native Americans, whatever you want to call, whatever is the right way to describe the people living here before Europeans came, that they actually, some people made a living at higher elevations than was thought before, and had specific tools they used to trap and catch whatever big sheep were up there and things. So they're finding out things that they didn't suspect by doing work up in different regions and finding evidence of tools. But in the thoroughfare, I know specifically where Joe and Arthur spent a lot of time in the park. In a lot of the areas where the elk are moving, they found evidence of spear points and other kinds of projectile points that native people would have used. So whether or not the migrations are happening in the same routes as they were 5,000 years ago, we don't really know, but I'm sure as the climate changes and as things change, 5,000 years ago it might have been a different climate, and we were still probably feeling the effects of the previous ice age. I mean, we still are today, but so it's hard to know, but it's a good question. I think if Arthur could know more, or these ecologists could know more about what these native people were doing, they certainly were following the animals. I mean, that's pretty certain.
There's evidence of that.
There's evidence all over, and there might even be a photograph in the exhibition of Joe holding a couple of fragments of spear points, right?
It's over there.
And they're in beautiful colors. I don't know if they're made of petrified wood or what, but they're gorgeous. And you're not supposed to take them, obviously. I think he probably either put them in his pocket or he put them back on the ground. It's hard to tell with Joe, but no. But I mean, even where I live in Connecticut, when I find a projectile point, I just can't believe people were making a living thousands of years ago in the eastern woodlands in Connecticut. I can barely go outside sometimes in the winter without complaining about the cold. But they knew what they were doing, and certainly the animals were moving, and people were moving after them, I would say. But sorry for the long-winded.
No,
there were also discussions at a certain point in developing this exhibition, like what were we leaving out? Were we leaving out some kind of Native American story? Also, it was like three white guys putting together this exhibition. Jenny we had one female, thankfully, who was a part of it. But there's always inevitably these questions about, are you telling the right story? Are you including the right information? If the information exists. One of my favorite things that we did when we were researching the exhibition was go to this place near Thermopolis, Wyoming, Legend Rock. Maybe you have been there, where there's all these beautiful drawings by whatever people were making them, Shoshone. They're actually pecked out of the rock using other rocks. They're not pigment, right? They're
Pictographs.
Pictographs, they call them, but they're beautiful. I mean, as somebody who likes to make images, these images are stunning, and whether they're trying to depict the animal accurately or just make kind of some abstraction that meant something to them that we'll never know, they're incredible images, and they, on the same wall over hundreds or thousands of years, they continue to make images, and they're all the way up to colonial times. There's even some pictographs of settlers' cabins and things, and there's no tourist buses, but anyway.
Do you have any favorite elements of the exhibition?
Any favorite elements?
Either yours or somebody else's?
Well, every time I come through it, my favorite parts are the memories of spending time out here, and the people, and the outfitters who took us into the backcountry. Who this exhibition wouldn't have been possible without, for Arthur and Joe, they relied on local people to, take them into the backcountry, carry all their equipment on mules and horses, and so the memories are, some of the best parts for me. I'm always a little bit, I feel like whenever I try to write a book or paint a picture, that the result of my creative output pales in comparison to the experience in such a extreme way that sometimes I just want to stop trying. But hopefully it's just, it's just the tools that we have to take what's in our minds and translate them to a surface where they can be recorded definitely have shortcomings, whether it's written language or painting. But I am sort of amazed that the tools that I use are so technologically primitive. A graphite pencil or a paintbrush made of animal hair and a wooden stick, and the pigments are ground, minerals, and that we can still tell stories in this age when we have cell phones with such primitive materials is an interest of mine as well. But the process is usually the fun part. And then engaging with anybody who might care enough to also share ideas. And
Were you in the thoroughfare?
I've never been deep in the thoroughfare, no.
It's 35 miles from the nearest road.
I know. Every
it's
time
pretty wild.
I've been invited a couple times, and it's always been like a 2 or 3 week trip, and I couldn't do the whole thing. But I do want to go back there. Although the landscape doesn't look as interesting as some other parts, but I'm sure it is. And I know that the trout at least used to migrate all the way up that Thoroughfare Creek or one of those creeks. But you've been back there, I guess.
I have.
Yeah. I'd love to one day. I know that they were expecting, when they went on, I think, 2 long trips back there to try to see the elk in their summer range, and they had a lot of trouble finding elk out there. Maybe because it's such a vast region that they're spread out, but they found little clumps of them kind of foraging together. But yeah. Any other thoughts or?
Regarding the silhouettes, I know we're not supposed to know.
Yeah.
Do they still relate to the animal in the
Yeah.
center in an ecological?
Oh yeah, definitely. They're all, I think, that's a hornlark, maybe that's a sage grouse. I think that's one of them might be a Clark's nutcracker. They're definitely things, I forget what they call I think those are black rosy finches or something. They're high elevation birds. These are sort of more lowland grasses and cactuses and stuff, and then the wildflowers on the other side are the high elevation plants. I forget some of the names of them, but those beautiful elephant head flowers, and they're gorgeous. But yeah, they're all the native plants, and aspen over here, and the lower country, mountain bluebird and magpie and things like that.
Well, I would like to invite people to look around, check out the exhibit, because it will be closing
In 15 minutes.
15 minutes, and that's how you talk.
And, yeah, so look around, 15 minutes, so about noon we'll close everything down because we're going to get started again to do all the finishing touches. But our shop wanted me to let you know that there is this awesome catalog for the exhibit called Invisible Boundaries that has the elk painting right on the front. And then there's also a new book by Joe Reese of his photography called The Yellowstone Migrations. So, both are available in the shop. Yeah, and
Thanks.
thank you for coming.